In January, the US military lifted a ban on women serving in combat roles. The move has reopened the debate over women serving in combat roles in the British military. Women already have fighting roles in forces around the world, including in several European countries, as well as Canada, Israel and North Korea, and the Kurdish Peshmerga. Here in the UK, some say decisions about a recruit's ability to fight should be made on a case-by-case basis, and potential combat soldiers should not be barred just because of gender. But others argue that most women may not be physically strong enough, and if they were hurt in combat, their male comrades would risk too much to save them. So, should the UK follow America's lead and allow women into combat roles? With me in the studio to discuss this are Major Judith Webb, a former senior army officer who in 1982 became the first woman to command an all-male field force squadron, Richard Norton-Taylor, defence and security editor at The Guardian, and Alison Baskerville, a former RAF sergeant and now a photojournalist who has documented life for British female engagement officers in Afghanistan. So, women in combat roles, a good idea or not? Judith Webb, let's start with you.
Well, you're talking about combat roles. Women already do fulfil a lot of roles on what people referred to as the front line. There's no such thing really as a front line in modern warfare. But what we're talking about is infantry soldiering. And I do not feel that there is a place for female infantry soldiers. I think there's plenty of roles for them in jobs which involve them in combat situations.
Richard Norton-Taylor, women in infantry positions, yes or no?
Yes, I think so. And the point that Judith made just now, that there's no such thing as a front line anymore. Well, the front lines are rather more confused than they were before. And also, we should talk about, I suppose, sometime, the future shape of modern conflict and modern warfare. I say, yes, women should have potentially the same opportunity as all men. They, after all, they're the victims of warfare. They should be kind of equality of arms, I would say.
Alison Baskerville, what do you think?
Again, I tend to agree with Richard on this one, having been out and seeing the girls on the front line, the nominated front line, which again doesn't exist in asymmetric warfare. And I think I've seen many capable women who would love the opportunity to be allowed to go front line and have those roles opened up to them, such as commando units.
Judith Webb, what do you make of this? The two other panellists are saying, yes, the fighting is changing, it's not the same world as it once was, and women should be able to be out there.
I can sympathise with what they're saying altogether, but my attitude is that it's the physical aspects which I feel women are not capable of. We are built but differently, we are different, and therefore we should acknowledge and appreciate that. And I don't feel that women have the physical capability to be infantry soldiers. And the long-term testing has not yet taken place to prove this. And it's all very well saying, well, let's try it and see. You can't do that in combat situations. And I feel that there are women who have suffered quite serious, permanent physical damage in combat roles in Afghanistan.
But is that because they're women or just because of the risks of being a soldier in a...
Well, obviously men suffer as well because, I was hearing earlier about men sometimes... the packs being weighed, 95-kilogram packs on their backs. Well, that is ridiculous for men or women. But even half that is too much for a woman. We don't yet have mixed rugby teams, do we? Because, men are not going to play rugby against each other with women in their teams. I know there are female rugby teams. We've had a wonderful example of a female boxer this year, and she did fantastically at the Olympics. She didn't fight a man, and I think that these sort of things must be taken into consideration.
Richard Norton-Taylor, we don't have mixed boxing. Why should we have mixed warfare?
We could have mixed boxing. I would have thought actually that women rugby players have a rather better record recently than men's English rugby team. But anyhow, it's not a question, I think, of lowering standards, I would say. It's a question of having the same standards, having maybe slightly more sophisticated training standards and criteria in training. Certainly, there are a lot of men joining the army. Now, I'm not so sure about the Air Force and Navy. It's slightly different criteria, I think, probably, but certainly in the army, men join the army, the recruits have been pretty, let's say, unfit army recruiters would say, for all sorts of reasons, state of British society or whatever. And anyhow, lowering standards, I take Judith's point completely. It shouldn't be a question of lowering relevant standards. I think the nearly 100, kilo kit at the back, I think, is will become increasingly relevant in modern warfare, in future operations involving the army.
So how are things going to develop? You talk about the future of operations. It seems you're suggesting we're moving away from a sort of hand-to-hand combat situation. How are things evolving?
Maybe hand-to-hand warfare. I mean, operations, special forces, for example, RAF regiment defending some airfield or drones which have been attacked by terrorists, certainly hand-to-hand in a sense. But hand-to-hand, I think, would need different criteria in terms of weight training and all that kind of stuff. Agility, certainly, but not necessarily the heavy, muscular, waist high body weight, which was traditionally been emphatically sort of men only kind of benefit, if you like.
Alison Baskerville, do you think women have any specific qualities that would actually give them advantage over men in infantry combat?
Well, look, this might sound really controversial, but it takes the same physical strength between a man and a woman to operate a trigger on a weapon. And really, that's how things are fought on the front line now, not hand-to-hand with bayonets. It's kind of a traditionalist view to look at women's role. But actually, what we need to think about is getting away from the aggressive side of it and the physicality of being on the front line. But a woman is traditionally seen as a peacemaker. And the women that I saw that were with those frontline units were able to pacify a situation, talk to the local Afghan men and women. Some of these girls have spent 18 months doing a Pashto course, and they speak in their language, and that is absolutely essential to improve that environment, because I don't think anybody joins the army with the intention to kill somebody or take a life. I think they join the army because they want a career, they want the challenge of travelling, and there's many other reasons than just wanting to be on the front line. So it's also important to know that a lot of the girls don't want to be in the infantry, but there are some who would like to be given the choice to do it and train hard enough so that they go frontline with their colleagues out on patrol, whether it be as dog handlers or police women. But they want to be at the same fitness level. They train with the lads in the checkpoints. They don't go and do their own thing. They train together, and they're very unified. So I think there is a lot that the girls do bring to that environment, and I think unless you go there and see it, it's very difficult to sort of comment on it and base it on facts and research. I think, to meet these women and speak to them, it really opens your eyes to what they actually want rather than talking on their behalf.
Judith Webb, do come in.
I can see that entirely, and I can see and have seen and have read about, and I think women are doing a brilliant job out there. That is not my argument. But that doesn't mean to say they've got to be infantry soldiers. They can train alongside men in many aspects. But infantry soldiers have got to be flexible. We're not only talking about Afghanistan. I know the Falklands War was 30 years ago, but the Falklands War could happen all over again as things are happening, turning out at the moment. And they had to yomp miles and miles and miles with heavy packs on their backs. That I do not feel is a suitable role for women.
Why not?
Because I don't think they've got the physical stamina to do that. Of course, there are occasional ones, but we're talking about an infantry soldier has to be an infantry soldier, and therefore it's got to apply to any woman who is in the infantry.
But I think there's exceptional women out there who could potentially pass this course. You're saying that we're not going to, it's no point trying it because they're going to fail because they're not physically capable. But I disagree with that, because I definitely have seen women who are capable of it, and there are certain units within the military, specialist units, that require exactly the same standard of training, and they do at least 6 months of some of the special training down at Hereford, which includes yomping 40 miles a day, and they pass it. So there are exceptional people out there who can do it, and I don't think you should delineate this by gender. You should give them the opportunity to do it.
Judith Webb, there are a lot of men who wouldn't meet these kind of standards, and equally there may be a few women who would. So why not allow them to do so?
What you're saying is suck it and see, and I don't think that's the sort of thing that we should be doing in combat situations. And what is going to happen, I can see, is, and it has happened to an extent already, is reducing the combat effectiveness of our army by reducing the basic requirements. And this is what is happening amongst the Canadian women, for example, that actually when it comes to it, they're not deploying Canadian women. They've got Canadian women in the infantry, but for whatever reason, they're not actually deploying them into combat roles, which is actually what has happened previously in World War II.
Well, there may be many reasons. I think a lot of perception amongst military commanders that the women, cannot, they haven't got a killer instinct. But as Alison said just a few minutes ago, that not only the peacemakers, I think there's a different. As long as you don't decrease, lower relevant standards, that's okay. Well, equality of opportunity, certainly, but that doesn't mean they have to be numerical equality. 50% of the people yomping down wherever it's going to be is not going to be yomping again, I don't think. I just think that to give the opportunity, it's a question of mental as well as physical state. Increasing that will be relevant, I think. Don't lower the standards. And I think a lot of experience in Canada, and certainly the British Ministry of Defence, has not given any reason why they had a review only a couple of years ago, actually, and they're going to have a review, they say, the British Minister of Defence, into the whole question of the future women's role in the army after, at the end, they say, of the Afghanistan withdrawal, i.e. at the end of 2014. Why they say that? Because they're thinking of different kind of conflicts and so on. But in Afghanistan, we know there's been British women on the front line, special forces there where they are, with their pistols and rifles on Land Rovers, really in the front there with men,
I agree entirely that we're not talking about the psychological effects. We're not talking about the emotional things. And the Russians, as we're talking on Voice of Russia, were very, very effective snipers in World War II, and they had huge numbers of snipers. That is a different argument, and I just think that we still come down to the physical thing. And are we going to spoil it for a lot of women who want to join the army, who don't want to fill those sort of roles, by demanding a basic level of fitness, the basic level of fitness which is required for infantry soldiers or for all soldiers when they join the army?
But that won't happen, sorry.
Yeah, no, that's good. Yeah.
That won't happen, because when people join the army, they choose the trade they want to join. They're not all going to be made to go and join the infantry. We're not going to have a bunch of Private Benjamins running around on the front line. I mean, the girls will choose as they join up what trade they want to do. There are so many opportunities there for them. And I go back to the point that I don't think there's going to be that many women who are going to want to join the infantry in the first place. And those that do it in different ways anyway, by doing other roles that they know they're going to end up being on the front line. And they're as capable and fit and as able to do the job as most of the guys that do it. And I'm only saying that from what I've actually seen.
You're listening to The Voice of Russia in London. I'm Tom Spender, and we're talking about women in military combat roles. With me in the studio are Major Judith Webb, a former senior army officer, Richard Norton-Taylor, Defence and Security Editor at The Guardian, and Alison Baskerville, a former RAF sergeant and now a photojournalist. But Alison Baskerville, the concern in some quarters is not necessarily that women can't do the job. It's more that men, if they are in a team with women and those women or one of them gets hurt or injured, those men may then kind of abandon the military objective at that moment.
That's a really, really old-fashioned view, because, and again, I'm speaking from experience. When the Taliban were shooting at us, and I'm talking from a different experience now, not as a photojournalist, I don't remember anybody coming up to me and saying, "Are you okay?" No, all they did is get behind the wall and start shooting back and got on with their job. Gender is irrelevant. And I was struggling at that point, and nobody said, "Oh, let's stop, there's a girl, she looks injured." I haven't seen that, and I think that's a load of rubbish, because I think when you wear your uniform, you've got your kit on, you're slightly emasculated anyway. And I think the guys are more focused on their own drills and to, trying not to step on an IED or get into any trouble. And I think once that pressure's there, all that other stuff that we sit and think about at home is irrelevant.
I would go as far as to say, just to add there very quickly, that could also change if there's equality of arms, if you like, women and men in the front line or any line, is that you'd get rid of or dilute the still patronising attitude, unfortunately elsewhere in society, as we know, towards women in the armed forces. And, it could lead to all sorts of attitudes, changing sexual attitudes, whatever, in the barracks or whatever it is. And I should maybe add that police constables, a lot of women police constables are in the front line. A couple recently were killed in Manchester, 2 police women constables. So bravery and all that kind of stuff can't come into it, and indeed fitness too, I would say.
I do want to come back to some of the points you've raised there, but I just want to go to Judith Webb and ask her, is it an old-fashioned stereotype that men
Of course it is. Yes, I accept that entirely. It is. It's an old-fashioned stereotype. And I got really upset when those 2 policewomen were killed and people were saying, oh, they should have had a man with them. I mean, for goodness sake, they're police officers, and they were police officers. And, what difference was it going to make? You're going to tell me that the guy was going to stand there and say, oh, it's, they've got a man with them. I'm not going to shoot them. No, let's be modern about the whole approach. And no, I don't think that happens. There was an Israeli story particularly, I think, that one.
Which Israeli story?
The fact that it was reported that when women in the Israeli Defence Force were injured, that it affected their male colleagues. And it's a very old story, and as Alison has said, she has seen in practice what happens is that a soldier is a soldier. But going back to the basic fitness test, everybody in the army has a basic fitness test. And are we going to say that it's going to be a different basic fitness test for men and women, or which it is at the moment, because it accounts for the fact that we're built differently, or are we going to have a basic fitness test which is reduced in standard for men to meet the demands of gender equality?
Richard Norton-Taylor, is that going to happen?
Well, fitness test is relevant, or could be relevant, and I think that as long as the fitness test is relevant to any kind of conflict people are going into, different units and so on, in different kind of wars or conflicts, and you must not lower standards. Certainly, I agree with you on that one point. You don't lower standards because of you want to in respect to the principle of equality, men and women opportunities. You don't lower standards, but a lot of women, and a certain amount of women, not obviously a lot, a certain amount of women would pass, I would say, standards that men could bar, relevant standards.
It's also the case that in the US military they have a serious problem with sexual harassment, and perhaps opening up the possibility of a sort of infantry combat role to women could have a much more broader positive impact. Is that something that would bring a lasting improvement to the kind of fighting capacity of the force and society as a whole? Alison Baskerville.
Absolutely. I think it's when people are divided and told that they can't touch the other side, and they're put into separate barrack blocks and they're put into separate locations, I think that's what encourages this behaviour. And I think if the lines are more blurred and actually people have more freedom to be able to mix or work on the front line, then I think it will improve. And all of the patrol bases that I've been to where there's a mixture of men and women, there's always been far less women. Some I went to, there was one girl. And I interviewed her as a journalist. She had no reason to lie, and I asked her, I said, what's your opinion? And she said that she had no problems with the men there. In fact, they kind of looked after each other. She was the medic, so she was fundamental to their well-being within that location. And there was none of that really happened. I just think that if you allow these girls to have more opportunities to do these roles, then it will become a normality. And it's why I do this work. It's why I cover these women in these frontline, not just frontline, but throughout the military in general, to kind of normalise it so that people see it and don't think it's odd or want to be satisfied with pictures of women with guns, which seems to be the kind of tabloid behaviour. So I think the more we see it, the more familiar we become with it.
Judith Webb, do you think there is a potential gain there in terms of overall attitudes and an improvement to our own society?
It is a really interesting point, actually, because media portrayal of women, and every time there's ever an incident which involves women, I mean, the media go mad, as they did with those two police officers. And the public perception, I don't know if it feeds it, which way it comes round, probably the media first. But I've done quite a few media interviews over the last couple of weeks. And the interesting thing is that 90% of people and I'm talking about, both sides of the press, have actually supported my view, which I find very interesting because, I sometimes to the other extreme, and that we mustn't have women and it's not ladylike and all sorts of arguments like that, which is absolute nonsense. But it has been interesting to see and to learn about people's perception and how the general public view women. I agree with Alison about the more men and women are integrated, all those sort of aspects. I'm on the same side. I'd come back to the physical thing.
Richard Norton-Taylor, what do you think? Is there a wider benefit for society?
Yeah, of course there is. And I think the more women, the less likely the media will be as mad as they are now, certainly. And you have forces, sweethearts and all that stuff. I don't know, maybe there are men equivalents, but in the future, more of those. But yeah, I think there was a recent report coming out of the British Ministry of Defence which said that there are more allegations, certainly, of rape or attempted rape and harassment of women in the armed forces. Things are not getting better. Now, that may be because women are getting more confident. Maybe it's a sort of transitional thing. I don't know the full significance of it, but it's still there. And I do think that, speaking as the only man of the three of interviewees here, that women will, that men actually have a less patronising approach. Women won't be the second-class soldiers and all that stuff. The less, special or exclusive things that women will not be able to do, the better. The barriers breaking down everywhere, which are not only physical barriers, but mental barriers, social barriers.
You're listening to The Voice of Russia in London. I'm Tom Spender, and we're talking about women in military combat roles. Judith Webb, did you experience this kind of sexism during your time in the military?
Funnily enough, I'm frequently asked this. Was I sexually harassed? No, I wasn't sexually harassed. But I can tell a story which you may or may wish to include, which was about a month after I took over as a squadron commander. We were on an adventure training exercise. And we'd had a few drinks in the evening, and I retired to my tent. And I suddenly woke up at about 1 o'clock in the morning thinking, there's somebody in this tent beside me, in my bed beside me, who shouldn't be there. And I just yelled very firmly and very clearly, get out! And can I tell you that over the next 4 years, I was never sexually harassed. Of course, there were incidents of being patronised by men. And I can always remember an argument with our quartermaster over a vehicle. And the quartermaster lost the argument when he said to me, oh, for goodness sake, Judy, you should be at home having babies, not arguing about NATO establishments. I said, thank you very much, Frank. I'll have that vehicle tomorrow morning. You just retain a sense of humour about it, That's my experiences of sexual harassment, but I wasn't, other than that, no. But it's an attitude of mind, I feel.
Alison, what about in Afghanistan? Was there any sense among the female engagement officers that you talked to of any kind of harassment at all?
No, actually. What I saw, which was really encouraging, was that the girls were there were only a very few of them, 6 actually in the whole of Helmand, attached to different places. And I think what the men noticed is that A, they could speak the language, and secondly, they could access areas that they wouldn't have normally got into. To speak to the local residents that were around their checkpoint. So they started to value them as an asset, and they weren't really treated obviously being female engagement officers, their gender did come into it, but it was more that they could take a softer approach into the areas they were going, because, the lads, after being there 6 months, don't particularly want to get shot at every day either. So if they take a woman on the ground with them and they go into compounds and start speaking with the locals, they then to gain a better picture of what's going on around. And that can come down to things as like where IEDs have been planted. So I didn't see any of that. And I've seen the girls in the gym with the lads wearing about the same amount of clothing, because male soldiers don't wear a lot of clothes in the gym out there because it's hot. And the girls just go in a sports bra and a pair of shorts, and they just muck in. And I think it's because they get used to it. It's familiarity. So it's not so much of an issue. And I definitely saw that. And I think attitudes and perceptions are changing, but probably in those more unique environments, where you are forced into that situation. So you have to get along with each other. But no, I didn't really see any out-and-out cases of it. I witnessed it myself when I first joined the Air Force, but not so much now.
Okay, and do you get a sense in society, are more and more women interested in a career in the military, do you think?
Yes, I do. There's a different generation coming through now, isn't there? I think they're more physically focused. I think developments in training, even the gym mentality now is much bigger, and a lot of girls doing things like CrossFit, which improves upper body, so they're more encouraged to do things like press-ups, stuff like that. Whereas I think when I grew up, I wasn't encouraged to do that kind of gym activity, but now I think girls now do it a lot more. So the army becomes like an option for them, or the Air Force or the Navy. So, and I think actually in this period of austerity where jobs are quite hard to find, I think the military is a very attractive opportunity for a lot of young men and women.
Richard Norton-Taylor, do you agree?
Yeah, I do in general. And also the head of the army, General Sir Peter Wall, the army's got problems because it's been cut. The general state of the British Army is not great morale-wise at the moment. Anyhow, he says, and this is my point about future conflict, which I think makes the whole thing more relevant, and maybe the weight thing less relevant. And he says that in future conflicts, the British Army and Western forces, if you like, or developed countries' forces are going to be more involved with more specific anti-terrorist operations. More agility is needed, smaller type of operations where they're going to be work much more closely with intelligence services. Now, and the last point I'd make on this point is, I think, is that it is often said by people I know in Her Majesty's Secret Intelligence Services that women may be better spies or intelligence officers for all sorts of reasons, which may be a matter for another discussion. But that is another relevant point, I'd argue.
Yeah, definitely.
Judith Webb, what do you think about that?
Absolutely. I mean, women have proved themselves time and time again. You know, as a special operations executive in World War II really showed what women can do. I think, you know, we much of what we do, we say or talk about, we agree on. I still come back to the physical thing, which infantry soldiers now, and comes back to why don't women boxers fight men boxers? Because they're different.
But in future conflicts, will there be infantry brigades even out there?
That I can see that obviously warfare has changed enormously, but you've still got to have the flexibility of infantry soldiers. What's happening in Mali at the moment, you know, with French? I mean, that is infantry soldiering, a lot of it out there.
But if they deploy a small amount of infantry soldiers who are going to go in a training or mentoring role, not specifically on the front line, you're then saying that women wouldn't be able to join that unit because they're not in the infantry, which then again goes back to my point about the female engagement role. There are women living in Mali, so you're almost cutting away that opportunity for these women to mentor that. And there are females in their military, I believe, isn't there?
The French, you mean, or the Malian?
In the French?
I think there are, yes.
I don't think there are women in French military, actually. But we always have had women attached to infantry units, to other units, in different roles. And if they're there as interpreters, if they're there in different roles, that's fine. But I've still come back to the you know, why? Why do we need to train women to be infantry soldiers when there are so many other things that they could do and so many opportunities for them? And I just think it's a different physical requirement.
All right, I'm going to wind up now because we've run out of time. I just want to whiz quickly around the table and ask, will the ban in Britain be lifted? Will we follow the American lead? And if so, when? Judith Webb.
I think inevitably it will happen. But it doesn't mean to say that I support it or I agree with it. I would still hang on out for women not to be in the infantry role.
Richard Norton-Taylor.
It will certainly in the next, by the end of the decade, I would say. And they're getting women in submarines, and that was argued against by commanders for ages. And it will happen.
Alison Baskerville.
Yep, I think it's. I agree with both the panellists. I think it will inevitably, the ban will be lifted, and I look forward to that. And some of my friends will certainly look forward to the opportunity to do that training and hopefully pass.
I'd like to thank my guests, Major Judith Webb, a former senior army officer, Richard Norton-Taylor, Defence and Security Editor at The Guardian, and Alison Baskerville, a former RAF sergeant and now a photojournalist. Thank you all very much. Let's start with you.
Well, you're talking about combat roles. Women already do fulfil a lot of roles on what people referred to as the front line. There's no such thing really as a front line in modern warfare. But what we're talking about is infantry soldiering. And I do not feel that there is a place for female infantry soldiers. I think there's plenty of roles for them in jobs which involve them in combat situations.
Richard Norton-Taylor, women in infantry positions, yes or no?
Yes, I think so. And the point that Judith made just now, that there's no such thing as
to be allowed to go frontline and have those roles opened up to them, such as commando units.
Judith Webb, what do you make of this? The two other panellists are saying, yes, the fighting is changing, it's not the same world as it once was, and women should be able to be out there.
I can sympathise with what they're saying altogether, but my attitude is that it's the physical aspects which I feel women are not capable. We are built but differently. We are different, and therefore we should acknowledge and appreciate that. And I don't feel that women have the physical capability to be.
Male comrades would risk too much to save them. So, should the UK follow America's lead and allow women into combat roles? With me in the studio to discuss this are Major Judith Webb, a former senior army officer who in 1982 became the first woman to command an all-male field force squadron, Richard Norton-Taylor, defence and security editor at The Guardian, and Alison Baskerville, a former RAF sergeant and now a photojournalist who has documented life for British female engagement officers in Afghanistan. So, women in combat roles, a good idea or not? Judith Webb.
The front line anymore. Well, the front lines are rather more confused than they were before. And also, we should talk about, I suppose, sometime, the future shape of modern conflict and modern warfare. I say, yes, women should have potentially the same opportunity as all men. They, after all, they're the victims of warfare. They should be kind of equality of arms, I would say.
Alison Baskerville, what do you think?
Again, I tend to agree with Richard on this one, having been out and seeing the girls on the front line, the nominated front line, which again doesn't exist in asymmetric warfare. And I think I've seen many capable women who would love the opportunity.
In January, the US military lifted a ban on women serving in combat roles. The move has reopened the debate over women serving in combat roles in the British military. Women already have fighting roles in forces around the world, including in several European countries, as well as Canada, Israel and North Korea, and the Kurdish Peshmerga. Here in the UK, some say decisions about a recruit's ability to fight should be made on a case-by-case basis, and potential combat soldiers should not be barred just because of gender. But others argue that most women may not be physically strong enough, and if they were hurt in combat, their